To another great week of measurement topics. So this week we're going to be talking about performance assessments. And the big question is, why would you ever do this? It seems like it's more fun, but it's usually a lot more work. Now the good news is that you have a leg up on this, because when we talk about essays, we're really talking about a written form of a performance assessment in many cases. So writing an essay or a composition class involves a ton of performance assessments. The main question we have, though, is that for things like science and math and so on, how do I turn a paper pencil assessment into a project that still gets me all the information that I need to know? So when we talk about performance assessments, I just want to give a few broad ideas. One, it's a general term for assessing the mastery of different concepts or skills, right? We've talked about essays, but other forms can include people giving a speech, making observations or conducting analyses, video presentations, right? Kind of an edited version of an oral presentation, writing reports, any kind of project or science experiment, or in art classes, right? If you're doing art for a living, you're doing a lot of painting or sculpture or media design, and all of that is a form of performance assessment. One of the things about performance assessments that's really good is that they focus on not just the end result, like getting the right answer, but also on the process you use to get to that final result. It's generally considered to be the most authentic form of assessment, right? So when you're in field and you actually teach a lesson, it's way more different, right, than writing a lesson plan. Writing a lesson plan gets you prepared to do it, but there's so much more that goes into teaching a group of students than just writing a lesson plan. And so when we think about real world stuff, we're usually thinking about how can I turn these things into performance assessments where my kids can actually do real world stuff. So like essays, we have restricted performance tasks and we have extended. So restricted really, again, are just shorter. They can incorporate objective test measures if you want to make them faster and easier to grade. Typically, it requires people to go beyond the data, identifying reasons or a rationale, even if they're picking it from a lineup, right, where they have to read and comprehend different rationales and choose the right one. Some examples, right? A letter of application for a job, reading aloud a section of a story for younger kids, performing a musical piece, and so on, right? This last one here, Sarah knows that half the students in her class were invited to Kim's birthday party. Also, half were invited to Julie's party. She thinks that's because 50 plus 50 equals 100. It is certain that she is invited to a party. Explain why Sarah is wrong. If possible, use a diagram in your experience. Right? So this is a concrete example of what that might look like, right? Where you have to actually teach the concept that, or I should say the student has to teach the concept that you are trying to assess. Another example looks like this, where you can have different artifacts, different graphs, right, where students have to interpret and explain something about them. The key thing, of course, is that it's not just going to be an interpretive exercise where it's a multiple choice question based on a picture or a graph. There needs to be some reasoning provided. When we get to the extended performance assessments, right, this is where you have a much broader set of skills that you're trying to assess. Prepare and deliver a speech to persuade people to vote for or against mandatory vaccinations, right? Something that might be coming up in the near future. Design and carry out an investigation to estimate the acceleration of a falling object such as a ball. Describe the procedure used, present the data collected and analyzed, and state your conclusions. And so on. And so we can go through each content area and think about a complex task that's going to require the integration of a lot of knowledge and the demonstration of higher level skills. And I will say one thing right now. Performance assessments should not typically be wasted on tiny stuff when it comes to cognitive skills and knowledge. If you're trying to see if somebody can play a B flat, right, on a trumpet, that's one thing. It's a discrete skill, and they have to do it to see if, and it's short. That would be a restricted performance test, and that's fine. But when using the extended version of this stuff, you typically save this for unit goals, and sometimes lesson goals, and I'm going to ask you to do a shorter version of one for the lesson that you did the essay for. But we'll see what challenges come up during that, because we're trying to kind of adapt it. But typically, because it takes so much time and effort, we save this for high-level stuff. Another example, when you think of any kind of lab experiment, right, you think that students are actually conducting a type of research and trying to solve a real-world problem. I remember one class I was observing once, the teacher just wrote a couple equations on the board and said, okay, determine the pH of the solution that you get for making all this stuff. And he said, go. And it was up to them to know what lab equipment they needed, to know what solutions they needed, to know how to figure out what proportions to add, and how to come up with that pH value. That was a performance assessment, required a ton of preparation. So when we think about performance assessments, right, we have restricted response, and we're talking about the ability to read aloud, or ask directions, or these very discrete skills. Extended response, again, the idea is that it's much more complex. Writing a creative short story involves a lot of skills. This involves the structure of the plot, character development, right, along with all the grammar, punctuation, and other narrative skills that you need to have. So when we think about performance assessments, we're thinking about a lot of different pros and cons. One, authentic assessments are great. That's a big plus. You can look at real-world tasks. You can make it a little more meaningful for the students. You typically also extend it beyond just a written or paper pencil type lesson, so you go deeper. You also assess the process as well as products, and so you can diagnose more easily what types of mistakes are made, and that will help your students and will also make you a better teacher. One more great thing is that it facilitates knowledge integration and complex learning. In other words, right, if I ask you to actually use everything you've learned about writing lesson plans to teach a lesson, you have to, 1, know the content, 2, know how to set goals, 3, know how to structure a lesson, 4, know how to assess along the way, and 5, deliver it all in an engaging way that's going to get kids interested, right? And just having somebody do that is a huge learning experience, much as I'm sure you have all found out in field experience, or there are very few of you who have done student teaching, right? It requires a ton of knowledge to do that stuff well. Now the cons, unreliable ratings, right? Because we are dealing with subjective judgments, you probably won't be completely consistent with yourself, and your students won't always know exactly what they need to do if they care enough to want to do well, right? And so we have intra, the consistency with yourself, and inter, consistency with your students, reliability issues. Second thing, and I can't stress this one enough, time consuming beyond belief. The projects that I typically do when I don't have such a big class take a ton of time, because I meet with every group at least once. There's multi-stages of revisions. There's this idea of talking through all the content and the goals and coming up with what's the main point of it all. And I think it's really effective, but it's too time consuming for me to do with as many students as I have this semester. And so I have to modify how I teach and how I assess. I'd like to do it, but I know I just can't. Finally, unless you're willing to put in a ton of time and effort, you are not likely going to cover all the goals that you have. You may not, in other words, be able to generalize the results of this performance assessment you make to adequately reflect all the goals that you have set out for your students. So you may have taught for 3 weeks and then you do a project. Well, that project might not include all the objectives from day to day. And that's something that you have to decide on whether or not it's worth it. Right? And sometimes it is. Now, in the text, Popham talks about a few things regarding some different elements that performance assessments should have. I expect you to know these things. And again, it's in the text. Popham talks about them. I want you to make sure you think about what does it mean for something to be generalizable, authentic, have multiple foci, be teachable, be fair, be feasible, and have scoreability. He adds that they should also be focusing on significant learning outcomes, right? Making sure that the skills you are going for are skills that really, really matter.